this segment of our consideration of the Moynihan report, we're going to be going on to the very last subheading in chapter 1 that talks about the prospect of equality. But as always, what we usually do before we head to a new subheading or a new chapter, we do a review of materials that we have previously looked at. And so we'll do that now. And really, there are some very, very interesting topics that we considered in regards to the review of the last subheading that we considered. Now, the demand for equality is something that is very important at this particular point. And that's the title of the last subheading that we covered. And right away, the subheading jumps into something that really speaks to the heart of equality itself. It paints a picture about liberty and equality. Really, liberty versus equality. Really, it talks about how that liberty was granted by President Lincoln, but not so with equality. And really, the two terms, even though they are synonymous with American society, at times they can be rivals of each other. They can be opposites, as it were. And so when you think about liberty itself, you think about freedom. You think about the ability to do as one pleases, right? But then when you think about equality, you think about having the same status in the United States as everyone else, to really simplify that particular term. But now, it would surprise you that in history, although liberty is favored, equality is simply tolerated. Individuals who have fought and died for liberty are not very interested when it comes to equality. Even though, as we mentioned, these two tenets are what makes up the foundation of American society. And so there's a difference. Many people would think that along with liberty would come equality, and it's not so. So now as we went on to talk about equality, we began to really focus on some points, right? Now, one of the things that we focused on in our discussion last week was Faulkner's definition of equality. Now, basically what William Faulkner was saying was that individuals are given the opportunity to line up at the start line and run the race to the best of their ability, right? And so that's the going notion, as the paper mentions, of most of white America, that you get the opportunity to run the race. And we call that what? Equality of opportunity. So no one's preventing you from coming to the starting line. No one's preventing you from participating in the competitions of life. Those are open to you. But then we begin to look at another aspect of equality. An aspect wherein individuals who line up at the starting line and they're given the privilege to participate as their own right. They're giving that privilege. But then to add to that, they're also expecting that the outcomes that they receive, the results that they receive, are the same as maybe another runner. And in this particular instance, we make it clear. One runner is the African American community, and one runner is white America. And so as the thrust for change continues to move forward, the conversation begins to evolve into a discussion about equality of outcome. So as we're running this race, then it's expected that at the end of this race, the outcomes that we have should be similar to those of another runner, right? So now, the paper makes it clear that really when you talk about equality, Nathan Glazer said that when you talk about economic equality, you're talking about equality of economic results. When you talk about equality in regards to education, you're talking about equality of results in education. So the two have been merged together. not only do you have the opportunity to compete, but then you're assured that your outcome would be similar to another runner. And so as we progressed, we found out that really this is the biggest challenge when it comes to the African American community. The paper calls it the principal challenge. And then there's a caution now that we read verbatim last week that if that particular challenge is not met, then there will be no social peace in the United States for generations to come. That's directly from the Moynihan report. So now we're getting into things now that even though they might be difficult to hear, difficult to go through, is necessary because it really paints a complete picture of what was done in order to try to assist with the African American community and what were the results. Okay? So that's our recap for last week. So now let's get into the topic that we have for this week. The prospect of equality. Now, we talked about the demand, but now the prospect of equality really highlights whether or not this is a feasible demand and what would be all of the necessary ingredients to reach the kind of equality that's necessary to have social peace. So now, right from the beginning, it talks about how it is that as far as Negro Americans, they have the potential to move from where they are to where they want to be. And so it's time to take a look at that potential. It's time to study that potential. It's time to direct that potential in such a way that it can realize the goals that have been set for the African American community. But now here is the caveat to this particular study. There's no way to quantify this kind of progress. The paper makes it clear that on a social health level or the social pathology within an ethnic group or religious or geographical community, there's no satisfactory way of tracking the progress in regards to whether or not equality is being achieved for this particular group. Nevertheless, the paper goes on to say that there are data that they are using. And then at this particular point, we get directed to the footnote. And basically, the footnote is talking about where no data exists in the particular area that we are looking at. And then they would take data from all of the non-white groups. But now it makes it clear in the footnote that when referring to Indians, Japanese, and Chinese, most of the categories that we'll be looking at, they are decidedly lower than what would be the norm for the African American community, right? So when you're talking about marriage, you're talking about separation, you're talking about divorce, you're talking about husbands being absent, right? Those figures for Indians, or we should say Native Americans, pardon me, Japanese and Chinese are decidedly lower than the figures would be for the African American community. So really, the figures that are mentioned in this report are an understatement. They're an understatement. Because as we mentioned, never have they tried to measure in a satisfactory way the various tenets that go into equality and the progression of equality, the movement toward equality by any group. They've never done this before. But it mentions that nevertheless, the opportunity demands that an assessment be made. So what does that mean for us? Regardless of the fact that this has never been done before, regardless that this approach has never been taken on, the climate that exists back at that time demanded, it called for strongly that some kind of assessment be made so that we can figure out what are the items that jeopardize the equality, the social peace within the African American community. And if we can work those out, then we can more readily help these individuals to be a greater part of society. Because think about it. The very statement that mentions there that there's no way to measure equality, no satisfactory way, right? To measure social health or social pathology within the community. Uh, Really, what you're saying is, in no uncertain terms, that these individuals are disenfranchised. They are. And so it's necessary now to take these individuals who have been viewed as a separate, maybe a inferior group, and try to apply some method to diagnose their situation and then come up with a solution for that particular situation. So let's keep going. Now, this is a quote directly from the report. I'll read this paragraph, okay? It said, that being the case, it has to be said that there is a considerable body of evidence to support the conclusion that Negro social structure, in particular the Negro family, battered and harassed by discrimination, injustice, and uprooting, is in the deepest trouble. While many young Negroes are moving ahead to unprecedented levels of achievement, many more are falling further and further behind. So, even though there is no satisfactory way to chart equality or the progression of equality in a particular group, it is undeniable in this particular instance that one of the main difficulties, one of the main roots of the difficulties that are experienced in the African American community, without a doubt, is the Negro family. The report describes it as battered, harassed by discrimination, injustice, and uprooting. So now you're looking at the dynamics of the community at large. Because this particular point we have to look at and be honest. We have to look at the fact that the Negro family, the African American family, is the basis for individuals who come from that family, right? There are difficulties that result from coming from a family where you see domestic violence. There are difficulties that come from a family where you see poverty. There are difficulties that come from a family where you see that the access to education is limited. And so all of these things come under the heading that was just used. The statements, the adjectives, I should say, that were just used: battered, harassed by discrimination, injustice, and uprooting. Those are words that are fitting for the Negro family at this particular time. Because you think about it, all of those particular ways of describing the Negro family have to do with the roots of the Negro family, the roots of the African American family. Even though it's not said, it's hinting, especially when it uses the term uprooting, it's hinting at the fact that individuals who occupy this community were enslaved. They were brought from another continent. And even though that has no particular bearing on the current state of the African American family, because we're 400, 500 years removed, at this particular time, it was an issue that could not be denied. And so now is the time to look at it and try to remedy the situation. And so that's what this paragraph was all about. The fundamental reason why there are so many difficulties within the African American community is because there were so many difficulties within the African American family. And that cannot be denied. So, where do we go to find the evidence that we need? Where do we go to carry this particular study out? Where can we go where there's a community of African American people who perhaps exemplify the difficulties that African Americans face in this country? Well, we're not left to reason. The study goes on to say that there was an intensive study done in the life of Central Harlem, New York. It says that the board of directors of Harlem Youth Opportunities Unlimited Incorporated, they summed up their findings this way: massive, massive deterioration of the fabric of society and its institutions. You get the gist of what they were saying? So the very institution of marriage, the very institution of family, the very institution of what it means to be a successful member of society had begun to deteriorate. It had begun to deteriorate. And so it's necessary then that this intensive study address some of the issues that's causing this deterioration. So now, what is the conclusion? They're giving us a foreglimpse of what we are about to see in order to prepare ourselves. The final two paragraphs we're going to read verbatim. Notice this point. It is the conclusion of this survey of the available national data that what is true of Central Harlem can be said to be true of the Negro American world in general. If this is so, it is the single most important social fact of the United States today. So now, the stage is set. The data that has been accumulated by the Harlem Youth Opportunities Unlimited Incorporated organization will be summarized in this particular report, and we look forward to it because, as always, my endeavor is to try to understand. As I mentioned, I'm not for the left wing or the right wing because it's two wings on the same bird. I just want to understand what was the premise of the paper and what were the results of this exhaustive study. Because now, looking at the history of the African American family maybe can shed some light on the present state of the African American family. So now we are headed in the right direction, I think. We're looking at the foundations of the African American community. And so next week, what we'll be discussing is the African American family, or as the paper entitles it, the Negro American family. So we look forward to going into chapter 2 and finding what really were the results of the intensive study that they did, looking at the African American family. What was its state at that particular time? And what were the items that led the African American family to be in the state that it was? There had to be some difficulties that were there. But what was the reaction to the difficulties? And maybe in looking at these things, we can see what reactions we need to take in modern times where we can learn. That's the goal of this particular project. All right? As always, man, I appreciate you coming back. This was a rather short segment, but what we're doing is we're going, as we mentioned, subheading by subheading, chapter by chapter, to make sure that we're getting the full picture. And I promise, like I did at the beginning of this, I promise that I will not insert any political commentary. I will just read from the report. And if we can maybe perhaps expound on it in light of what we already know about the report, then that's what we'll do. So thank you for coming back. As always, be easy.